hello, everybody, and a wonderful welcome to our next edition of Leaders for Humanity. And I have to say, I'm even more excited than usual and super proud that we have yet again a person who really doesn't need any big introduction, because it's one of the very few people who I would say we have encountered who has been able to change the world of business, or if not the world, certainly the story of business. And that, I think, is a huge achievement in his very lifetime. And it's with the greatest pleasure that I welcome today on the show Professor Ed Freeman. Ed, a big welcome to Leaders for Humanity.
Thanks.
And it's
thanks for having me.
It's super, super exciting. I think the other thing, Ed, that we said it in the pre-session, what I as a professional really appreciate is that you're actually one of the few philosophers and academics who has tried to write for people like me, right? Practitioners and people who are in business and who ultimately need to apply some of the wisdom that comes from academia. So we will hear more of that in a second, but as usual, let me briefly introduce the flow, which for most of our followers will already be very, very clear. The first is a quick look at the Good Organizations inquiry. What are we here to do? The second piece is a proper introduction of Ed Freeman, which Antoinette will do. And of course, as always, I forget to introduce Antoinette properly. So hello to Antoinette. And then we will go into the dialogue. And the Good Organizations inquiry is, and let me try to frame it slightly differently today in the pragmatic version that Ed is, I think, going to explain to us in a second. It is about creating a new narrative that can also create different action, different impact in the world. And our hypothesis is that we need to find a new narrative that helps people to look at the world differently from three different lenses. From the individual lens, how can they find a meaningful life that also allows them to step responsibly into the society, into the organizations they're in? For organizations, because I think, as Ed will explain to us, it's not enough to talk about ethics and business separately. We need to find ways to revise the very way we do business. And that might require us to look at the structures and the functions and the roles in organizations in a separate fashion. And finally, how do we create a good society where the organizations contribute to society and the individuals inside the organizations flourish and contribute to both organizations and society? And that's a little bit the dialogue that we're trying to have with lots of interesting people who are having parts of the puzzle. And again, it will be very exciting to see which parts are in Ed's mind. Also because, Ed, I have to say, you have made the preparation again very, very hard for us, because you are a very prolific writer. And not only that, you also enjoy stepping into different narratives and different viewpoints, which of course is something we will try to tease out. And with that, I would say, over to a proper introduction. Antoinette.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited to have Ed Freeman here, who is an American philosopher, professor for business administration at Darden Business School, University of Virginia, and of course best known for his decade-spanning work on the stakeholder paradigm and his dedication to give us new narratives, as Otti already said, to look at what ifs and then ask, is it more useful to look at it in this way? Does it give us better information? Does it help us to shape a better life? Ed has been awarded with several Lifetime Achievement Awards from the World Resource Institute and Aspen Institute, the Humboldt University Conference on Corporate Social Responsibility, the Academy of Management, and last but not least, the Society for Business Ethics. In practice, he's probably best known for his landmark book, Strategic Management, a Stakeholder Approach, and of course for being the inventor of stakeholder capitalism. We're going to talk about that later. In academia, next to his many articles and books, I also have to say he is immensely often cited. Seldom have seen that, more than 116,000 cites. But I think for him, it's even more important. He's proud to be a world-class teacher. I heard a dedicated cook and co-founder of the house band of the Red Goat Records. So I hope I was correct with that. Probably not. As usual, it's always difficult to make such an introduction. And that's why, Ed, I would like to give you the floor now. What is important to you if you would have to describe yourself with a few attributes?
Well, I don't, thanks, Antoinette and Otti. I don't really know. I mean, people ask me sometimes, do I have any hobbies? And I say, well, I get to teach, talk to students, and write and travel all over the world and talk to people and write about business, and I write music and play some music, and now I have a podcast, and I work out a lot. I've done martial arts a lot, and I don't really have time to have a hobby. That all kind of fits together for me, and I don't really know. I don't really have any goals. I just try to live kind of every day in this in this way. So, if I had to describe myself, I'd describe myself as pretty much a one-trick pony. I mean, I've been saying the same thing for a very long time, which there are different ways to say it, but it comes down to the same thing. I get a lot of credit for stakeholder theory, but I didn't invent it, and I never claimed to have invented it. So it's a pretty good trick, but it's pretty much one. It's that we need to see business as about how to create value for stakeholders. And
very exciting. I want to, the one thing comes to my mind, the platform, you just said you didn't invent it. And I think that's also very nicely described in your books. You always say there's a group of people that created this narrative. Not, I think I remember being in Davos, the last physical one, 2019, 2020, where I think Klaus Schwab claimed he invented it. And I think that created a bit of a storm in your fellowship.
He may have invented it, but he invented it 10 years after the people at Stanford Research Institute and Eric Rinman invented it. I wrote to Klaus about that. I don't know him. And I said, look, I'm trying to keep up with this, give me, help me out. Here's the story I've got. And I sent him a couple of books, and I didn't get much of a response. So I just assumed he was not interested.
Let's go with something else. You're such an interesting personality, if I may say that from afar. And I recall one of your videos on your stakeholder.org website, which I invite all of our listeners to have a look at. And you say something like, in your youthful idealism and enthusiasm, you decided to get a PhD in psychology, and you came in
philosophy. A PhD in philosophy.
And you came home, and your dad basically said, congratulations, you'll never have a problem with finding a job because they opened all these philosophy factories down on the interstate. And I just thought, well, that is such a great starting point. How was it? What were the adventures that you had to go through?
Well, I grew up poor on a farm in Georgia, and other people that are seeing this, if they grew up on a farm, they understand that the first thing you want to do is get off the farm for the most part. And so I knew I wanted to be a teacher when I was fairly young, in my teenager years, and education was the way out. That was the way out of poverty and the way out of being on the farm, because the farm wasn't very productive. We couldn't make a living at it, and I was really good in math. So I went to Duke University in North Carolina and studied math, and I had to take a couple of humanities courses, so I took a couple of philosophy courses. I also took 2 graduate math courses as a third-year student there, and with all the grad students, etc. And I think the best way to say this is I met my match mathematically. It was clear that, it was clear to me that I didn't want to pursue a PhD in math. And philosophy and Socrates was a lot more interesting. Ethics was a lot more interesting. I actually never thought about am I going to be able to make a living at this? I had done, I knew how to work hard from the farm. I had done every kind of crap job to put myself through school. My parents did what they could, but they couldn't really afford a school like Duke. And so I never really thought about that because I just, it's what I wanted to do. I went straight through. Then I just got lucky. I had a guy on my PhD committee said, what are you going to do next year? Now I'm maybe 22, 23. I'm pretty young. And I didn't even know what I didn't know. And he said, you should do a postdoc. And I said, okay, where? And he said, Pittsburgh. I know some people there. Great philosophy department. I went, yeah, great. And he said, but you're interested in this ethics and decision-making stuff. You ought to go to Wharton. And I, honest to God, said, what's Wharton? I'd never heard of it. I didn't know. And he said, it's a business school. And my face kind of fell. And I said, is it a good one? I didn't know, He said, well, yeah, it's one of the best. And then I asked the right question. I said, where is it? And he said, it's Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania. I was at Washington University in St. Louis. And I said, well, I might be interested because my girlfriend at the time was going to Penn in city planning. So I trucked off to Wharton without any idea what I'm doing and get hired. And, it was just blind luck. The girlfriend thing worked out. We've been married for 45 years. So that part was pretty good. But it was just serendipity, and kind of being open to that stuff, I think is part of good luck.
It's a wonderful story. I'm not even sure whether I have to ask another one, but I think I'm interested in that one always, especially because you always say relationships are very important. We are also co-created with whom we are. So, of course, I'm really interested. What are your main role models or influences from a relationship perspective?
Well, Maureen, obviously my wife of 45 years and our three kids, Ben, Emma, and Molly. You learn a lot about yourself through your kids. Ben and I have started a couple of companies. We started Red Goat Records to bring the sort of joy of rhythm and blues and the Motown and Stax in the 21st century. And we've started a company called Stakeholder Media, which is, he says to me, if you want people to do stakeholder thinking, you got to do a podcast because that's what people do now. So we've started the Stakeholder podcast. We've got about 80 episodes or so that are there. And Maureen has been my a loving critic, but a critic. She does very well at keeping my ego in check and all those kinds of things that every academic needs and most don't have. She read the first draft of that old Stakeholder book. She had by this time gone back and gotten an MBA at Wharton after we were married, and she reads this draft of this Stakeholder book, which I wrote in like 8 weeks, and it read like you wrote it in 8 weeks. And she looked at me and goes, well, this is just common sense. She claims she never said the following, but I think she did. She said, you'll never make a living at this. Now, the greatest thing about getting a PhD in philosophy and falling in love with somebody is they love you or marry you for who you are because you don't have any prospects. And so she's been a really important critic. I have a draft of a new book, and she just read it this past weekend. I got a little better feedback on this one.
I love it. And I think we're going to come back to that theme. And someone suggested philosophy is a love affair with questions. And I think in your work, I can actually see all that too.
Yeah.
At this point, let's move into the dialogue. And it's going to be an interesting dialogue today for sure. And I just want to, in the usual fashion, frame the structure of the dialogue just a little bit. As usual, we go from the question of what is good, what is morality, what is a good society. In this case, focusing very much on that notion of stakeholder theory, to what is a good organization. And here we want to look a little bit into what does it mean to create an enterprise that is really stakeholder oriented? How does that operationalize itself? And then we want to move towards leadership and transformation. How do leaders, especially, but any organizational citizens, kind of contribute towards becoming a stakeholder-oriented, purpose-driven company? And I think we also want to get your views on business schools, right, in that challenge of creating a new narrative. And here, let me start us off with narrative, indeed. I think you said something in one of your books, which I really love, which was, we're only as good as the stories we tell. And I think let's maybe use with that, start us off on the listeners with two stories, Ed, if you would play with us a little bit. The first story about what are the current narratives, the dominant narratives of capitalism that are going around. And I think in your book, you describe the labor, the government, the investor, the managerial story. So what are these narratives and what is the problem with that? And once we've got that framed, if you could take us into the stakeholder capitalism or stakeholder theory narrative, how does that work instead? I think that would ground the conversation for everybody listening so that people who haven't read your books can follow the rest.
Well, the dominant narrative, which is, when I say dominant narrative, it's the way we often unconsciously frame things. The dominant narrative in business is that business is about the money. It's about the money, and it's about making profits for shareholders, and it's this shareholder primacy that's there. Now, of course, not all companies have shareholders. That's why the dominant narrative is about, look, when you talk about business, you got to talk about making money, and that dominant narrative, you could replace shareholders with workers. It's about doing what's best for workers, or you could replace it with, it's about doing what's best for government. You could replace it with any kind of one group. Wouldn't matter. It would be the same kind of partial narrative, because businesses have always and will always create value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and the people with the money. And it's an and here. And those interests are interconnected. And if we begin to understand that, then we can improve the hell out of it. If we don't understand it, if we think it's just for shareholders or just for labor or, just for customers, we're going to miss some of those interconnections that are there. We're going to miss the opportunity to improve how that value creation goes. So, I've always seen this not as any kind of idealization. I've always seen it as, look, this is just how business works. And we're missing the narrative. If we tell a better story here and can see it and frame business in this way, we can make business a lot better, a lot more effective. I think you can make more money if you want. And so a lot of what happens here is you get a lot of false dichotomies. You get stakeholders versus shareholders. I've never known what to do with that because shareholders are stakeholders. You get, what's more important, employees or customers? Well, I don't know. I mean, I've had journalists ask me all the time, what's more, professor, what should businesses focus on, ethics or profits? And my answer to that is, that's a lot like asking me, do I want a heart or do I want a lung? I'm pretty much in favor of having both of those things. And so when I say change the narrative, I'm not just talking about changing the way we talk. I'm talking about changing the way we see things and act towards them, and opening up new possibilities, because we can see that. This gets at a view of who we are as human beings. What a pragmatist would say is, look, what we're able to invent vocabularies to help us solve our problems. And then we're able to cooperate together to use those vocabularies in this cooperative way. And evolution, by the way, probably picks us out as good cooperators. And so this idea that the vocabulary you use, language is a tool, the vocabulary you use depends on the problem you're trying to solve. The problem I've always tried to solve was how can business and capitalism, if you want to call it that, be better? How can it be more effective? How can it lead to a better society? And I think you have to realize what it actually is. It's how we create value and trade with each other.
You want to quote you, Ed, because again, stakeholder theory.org, everybody have a look at it. But I think the way you frame it there is the task of executives is to create as much value as possible for, in brackets, all stakeholders without resorting to trade-offs. Great companies endure because they manage to get stakeholder interests aligned in the same direction. I thought that was a very kind of succinct and nice framing. And if I may, just to make sure everybody listening gets those main dichotomies that you just explained, I think one, in your separation theory, you make that first one even clearer, that there is no difference between kind of morality versus business, society versus business. I think the second one you pointed to was purpose isn't the same as money. And then the third one, this self-interested nature of the human being. Do I get that right? That those are kind of the core flaws that you see in the current stories?
Well, I'd put it slightly differently now. I would say in this new book called The Power of And, I would say, look, it's about purpose and profits. It's not one versus the other. It's a dichotomy of saying it's purpose or profits. That's the problem. It's purpose and profit. Look, businesses have to make money. We have a saying in the music business, everybody got to get paid. And I don't care whether you're a not-for-profit or a university or a band or a big Fortune 100 company, you got to make money or you can't exist. It doesn't follow from that, just like, I need to make red blood cells to live. Doesn't follow from that making red blood cells is the purpose of my life. And that's the mistake that gets made here. And this idea about self-interest, which is so pervasive in the way we think about business, I find that just completely disrespectful to say that human beings are one-dimensional, self-interested maximizers of their short-term self-interest. That's bullshit. I'm sorry, but, anybody's ever had a child or anybody's ever been in love knows we are capable of great acts of kindness. We're capable of nasty stuff. I mean, the world history is full of that. We're capable of self-interest and power mongering and being bad, but we're also capable of great acts of kindness and love. And to say it's one in business and not the other, I think that's just a mistake about what business people do. We can be self-interested and other regarding at the same time because we're complex beings who figure out new vocabularies to help us solve our problems.
And I just want to make a bracket for later. What I'm also listening to here is another aspect which I find really interesting is because you've been telling that in other words or the same words for quite a long time. And I especially also take up, why can I make a distinction? Why should a customer be more important than an employee, for instance? So you always have this ecosystem view, you have a paradoxical view, if you want to put it this way. And I'm very amazed that even in the stakeholder literature, that wasn't taken up so quickly as it could have been. So I find that really interesting, because we're now looking at some things, I know that from Sibyl, which if I look at your writing, have been laying around for a very long time. I just want to park that because it's interesting that even in academia, we have problems in accepting a more holistic narrative. So that's just something to park.
Well, I know, when I wrote that old book, I mean, essentially no one cared. I thought I was doing strategy. I thought I was going to take the strategy world by storm, because I was working with a bunch of companies and they thought this was great stuff. And in the academic world, essentially, no one cared. The strategy people were in the throes of the resource-based view and Michael Porter and trying to become little economist, and no one really cared about this. It's interesting. Yes, that old book has something like, 45,000 citations or something. And somebody asked me once, what's it like to write a bestseller? And I said, I don't have any idea, because they only printed 2,000 copies. So either there's some copies in libraries with the ink is worn off the pages, they've been used so much, or what I think is actually true, no one actually read this book. They did cite it, and I did write a very citable book, which if I cared about that sort of thing, I guess would be smart career management, even though honestly, I didn't even know anything about this for a long time. But in fact, to be honest, I didn't even think the stakeholder idea was the most interesting idea in the book. I thought that was so obvious. Like my wife, Maureen, said, this is just common sense. I thought and I didn't know anything about business or business theory, remember, because I came at this from philosophy, and philosophers don't know anything about business for the most part. I thought there were some interesting ideas in the book, but this idea of enterprise strategy, which is sort of an idea really about purpose, I thought that was much more interesting, how you could connect purpose back to moral theory, back to Rawls or utilitarianism or virtue ethics, etc. I thought that was pretty interesting. In the last 40 years, nobody else has thought that was very interesting, but
surprisingly, one of the people we spoke to, Harry Tsukas, took up exactly that, and he wrote an essay. Antoinette, you have to help me. Strategy as a moral method, moral theory.
Yeah.
So Harry Tsukas took it up, and he was a vegetarianist, of course, but I think nobody read that article either. So
I don't think so. Yeah.
Although in practice now we have this big zeitgeist purpose, but again, how is it linked to the morals? And I mean, that is probably also one of the next things we're going to look at, is of course often not discussed. I mean, it's just we need to have something meaningful, but not how do we come about it.
Well,
the normative core of that.
Purpose can be pretty nasty stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, several years ago, we had the white supremacists and Nazis march here in this little town of Charlottesville, where the university is. And, they were a high purpose organization. It was not a purpose that could stand any moral scrutiny, but nonetheless, it was a high purpose organization. And I think we often, given this separation idea about how we can't do normative work, that it's all just descriptive, I think people don't make that link to ethics nearly as often as they should.
And maybe this is exactly where we can now go a little bit more deep diving in, because I mean, of course, that's a very strong part of what you're saying is needed. But you also helped us a little bit, because we were kind of sometimes struggling to see what is now the normative core you're in favor of. Is there something you're in favor of? So maybe we just start off with pragmatism, because I mean, that's obviously where you come from, and maybe you can just elaborate first from the pragmatic angle, what normative is all about, what ethics is all about.
Well, again, I think the idea that there's a fact-value distinction, there's a normative descriptive distinction, is problematic. It's easy to illustrate in stakeholder theory, because when I call somebody a stakeholder, I've made a normative claim. I've said they have a stake, and therefore there's certain things they deserve or owed or etc. So the very idea of stakeholder theory mixes up normative and descriptive. Now, this is a long tradition in philosophy. It was only the positivists in the 30s and 40s that said, look, what's real in the world is what we can verify. And what's real in the world is what we can verify with our senses, with our instruments, is what we would now say is empirical. In the 40s, I won't go through all of it, but certainly by the time we get to 1950, philosopher by the name of Quine, positivism has been thoroughly killed. The idea that you could separate out what's conceptual with what's empirical was completely discredited. I mean, think about it this way. You've got theoretical sentences here, and you've got observational sentences, data here. Now, how do you know the observational sentences are the right ones for the theoretical sentences if they're separate? The answer is you can't. There's no way to make that distinction without already assuming that those things are connected. In a very famous paper called, which I'd encourage everybody to read, it's called Two Dogmas of Empiricism. And one of Quine's colleagues at Harvard, Hilary Putnam, wrote a nice little book called The End of the Fact-Value Dichotomy, which does an even better job at showing kind of why that's true. The story I like was in a paper in a journal called Philosophy of Science in 1953. It's called The Scientist Qua Scientist Makes Value Judgments. It's by a professor of mine, Richard Rudner. And he tells a story of when the scientists were about to detonate the first nuclear reaction on Earth, the Chicago pile back in Soldier Field in Chicago during World War II. So they're about to detonate this. There is a small non-zero probability that the whole atmosphere is going to turn to sand. Now the probability is very small, 10 to the minus, I don't know what it was, but it was really tiny. But nonetheless, the scientists had to decide that they should do this experiment. In the process of doing science, they had to make what was essentially a moral judgment. Now think about this for a minute. If physicists do this, by the time we get down the chain to management, isn't it just foolish to think that we can do descriptive, purely descriptive stuff? I mean, the vocabularies we use orient what we pay attention to. And so, this fact value distinction and this theory data distinction, and there are a bunch of others. What a pragmatist would say is look, think about how theory, data, and interpretation are all they're intertwined, and they're intertwined, and the ones that are help us solve problems. What we should do is try to find better ones, invent new ones that help us solve problems.
Because this, I think, is really interesting, and I'm reflecting also on some of the critique that I think pragmatism in general, or stakeholder theory in particular, have attracted in exactly this space. Because it seems to be the notion of kind of what works. Right, so what is useful is good, and I think the quote that I found,
that's a way simplification of pragmatism.
I know exactly, probably very undue as well. I thought there was a quote by Otti, I believe, that we found. We said one pragmatist conclusion is that if the answers make no difference to managerial practice, then the question is irrelevant. So there's a notion of kind of what exists is what matters, but the two criticisms that I found most convincing is one, the relativist one. Before you know it, you're in a relativist position where everything has kind of value that could be very different based on contingency. And the second that has most often come up is the utilitarian criticism, where people say you're actually unduly kind of perpetuating a logic of outcome matters more than, so to speak, morality. Well, what is your normal, I guess, response?
So both of those criticisms are to me pretty disingenuous. The relativism one, look, relativism is the view that because you believe something or because a culture believes something, that makes it right. That's not a very interesting idea. It would say there's no need to have any sort of moral talk. We just cut open people's brains and see if they truly believe it or not. Relativism is different from pluralism. Pluralism, and Rorty's a pluralist, and I am too, says, hey, there might be multiple ways of, let's say, living an ethical life or having a good or organization. And what we need to do is, again, see what problems a variety of narratives solve. That's what I was trying to do by thinking about normative cores. To say, well, wait, we could have an organization that's more in line with feminist values, or we could have an organization that's more in line with the difference principle of Rawls, or we could have an organization that's more in line with utilitarian principles. And then we could see what problems they solve, what problems they don't. So I think people often mistake pluralism for relativism.
There's still a lot of risk, Ed. So one of the critiques was Freeman and Phillips, which explicitly situate the stakeholder genre in a libertarian ideology embracing liberty, personal freedom, individual property rights, apolitical corporate activity, and minimal night watchman state. So the accusation to say you guys are situated.
And what else did we position it as? We positioned it, which that critic expressly didn't say, this is about responsibility. And the main point of that paper, we wrote that paper after I got called a socialist on the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal 13 years after my book was published, and it really made me angry. And we tried to show that any decent libertarian, it's not the only way to think about stakeholder theory, but any decent libertarian ought to be a stakeholder theorist. Why? Well, look, if you don't want government to do stuff, you better take responsibility for the effects of your actions on others, and who you can affect and who can affect you. And so just from the standpoint of trying to be a good libertarian, you should be a stakeholder theorist. Now, of course, libertarians hate me because they think, most of the people talk about libertarians don't want to talk about responsibility. But if freedom makes any sense at all, it's not that teenage boy freedom, I can do whatever I want. It's a freedom that's bounded by our sense of being responsible to each other. And that was the point of that. The point of that paper wasn't to say that's the only way to think about this, but that you could. Mm-hmm. Again, I warned you, I'm a pretty slippery guy to pin down. Am I a libertarian? I don't say that. I don't say that anymore. I would have said it at some point in the past. I don't say it anymore because I don't know what a libertarian is anymore because so many of them don't believe in being responsible. So many of them don't believe in the self as connected to others.
So
And
I hear you, because, for instance, you also have, of course, written about care ethics, and that it is a different normative core. So we would have a specific problem and look at that problem with two different lenses. That is one way. But if I take up the pluralism, I find it quite interesting that in the end you also say it's about communication. So you say moral questions are up for grabs. Does there need to be negotiate within the community? I guess this is this problem-oriented view. But then, of course, it becomes very important whom to include in that conversation and how to do that conversation. So I was wondering whether you have more ideas here, so maybe going a little bit towards almost discourse ethics.
Yeah, I'm not sure I know what discourse ethics is. There's this.
I believe you know
this idea that there's this idea of kind of perfect communication in discourse ethics. It comes from Habermas, and that's decided. Habermas is close to a pragmatism, but not quite. Because of this, I think we have this idea. We get it from Plato. Of there's kind of one way to define the good. Mm-hmm. And so we need a conversation that there's, one way to define the good life or good organizations, etc. And I think that's a fool's errand. I think there are multiple ways to define that. And then we need where they conflict, that's where we need a conversation. Now, who's a part of the conversation? Ed, would you tell us once and for all, please, who are the stakeholders? My sense of that is very much a positivist idea that let's define our terms and then we'll go from there. What problem are you trying to solve? If you're saying, well, I'm trying to solve the problem of where there are two competing ideas of the good, we need to work out the points of conflict. And then my answer is, well, who's affected? And they would be the stakeholders. In a practical sense. That's not
relativism.
No, it's not relativism at all. I'm just trying to solve a problem.
I'm thinking about, I was part of The Economist webcast 2 weeks ago about problems in the world. And literally, the business editor of The Economist, the journal, suggested that stakeholder capitalism was a fuzzy idea and maybe a defense mechanism of business roundtable companies and the likes to avoid regulation. So I think that the risk is that people just make of it whatever they want. And isn't there still a need to find what good is, even if it's contingent, even if it's pluralist? But going into the living room and killing your mother is never a good idea, whatever circumstances there might be.
Whoever thought it would be. Look, the idea that this is fuzzy and relativistic and all that is again, it's an old criticism. There's nothing new. I read this same thing about a review of what's called woke capitalism. This is just what business is. What business does is it creates, show me a business that doesn't create value for its customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and people with money. And then I might say, well, okay, maybe I'm wrong, but I've never found one that doesn't. Now, there might be one that creates negative value for some and positive value for the other. There are lots of those. There's certainly cases where, companies can use the stakeholder language as a virtue signaling. But think about it for a minute. How much have you heard companies who don't really care about shareholders go on and on about the importance of shareholder value? Sartre told us that, there are no limitations on bad faith. There are no limitations on bad faith and self-deception. And so I'm kind of tired of this is self-deception right here. It might be that all 181 business roundtable companies are lying to us. That might be true. I tend to start by believing what people say and giving them a chance. and then holding their feet to the fire, much the way that Just Capital is doing that, right? Just Capital is seeing itself as, trying to find ways to measure and collect data on whether or not the public companies are serious about this or not. And, it's the old story. Hang on, there's one more thing I think I've got to say. There's the old story about business says, look, business sucks. It's about profits, and that's bad. And, everybody, or you're on the right and you think, well, that sucks, but that's business. And the thing that happens here is what I would call saints and sinners thinking. Business people are sinners. If you find a good one, eventually they'll make a mistake, and they can be sinners. See, what's doing the work here is the ideology. What's doing the work is the ideology that business as primarily profit making is problematic. I don't think that's true. I'm not in the grip of that old story, as so many people are. Sounds like the editor of The Economist might be too. Certainly they traditionally have been a little more friendly to stakeholder theory than some of the American media. So that's too bad if that's
Nice.
If that's true. Sorry, that's the.
This is
and I think the again, sorry, Antoinette, just one final thing, because I based on what you said, still to a degree we should be able to measure the strength of the narrative by the actions people take. And I think here, I guess the Economist was playing a little bit to this recent kind of more negative critical analyses that were done. One was the BRTs, the Business Roundtable signatories, have not changed their corporate governance guidelines or executive pay structures away from. So the idea is it's not stakeholder capitalism that is wrong itself, but it hasn't been implemented. Is that fair?
So no, I mean there's a piece of it that is. Look, how long have we been trying to change the narrative that men and women are morally equal? What, 100 years?
Longer.
Well, 100 years here, probably longer in other places. How are we doing on that? How are we doing? I mean, it's better, but are we finished with that? No, we're not. It's going to take time, and it's going to take seeing business as fully human. That is, people make mistakes. They may not know everything to do, and they might make some mistakes intentionally. I'm not arguing against that. What I'm arguing against are these I think ideologically driven arguments that we know businesses don't mean this. Well, you might. I don't know that, because I'm pretty sure a lot of them do mean it. Now, the other thing is, I think that particular argument says corporate governance has to change. I spent a lot of time trying to figure that out, and I'm not so sure about that now, because for starters, shareholders don't own companies in the U.S. Companies own themselves.
And this myth about discussion going on for quite a long time already. I mean, it could be the possibility, and it has to do a lot with, as you say, that we are really thinking more in the new narrative. And I just want to remember our listeners as well. And now Otti is going to smile because that's my favorite article in the world. No, not really, but I mean, think about Ghoshal and Moran, who were very much in your camp when they said, let's stop with this bad management theories destroying good practice, because this is exactly not how we bring also the aspiration back that we are all also moral individuals. So I think
one of my favorite papers as well. My only regret was Sumatra didn't use it to go talk about stakeholder theory, which he could have.
He might have. Unfortunately,
he passed away.
For everybody that he passed so early.
Well, the other thing that article does is it points us to another one of my heroes, Friedrich Hayek, who talks about the pretense of knowledge, and in his Nobel address. And the pretense of knowledge, the sort of, pretending that we're certain about stuff, and pretending that method makes us more certain is, again, one of those things that pragmatists would say, look, any belief is revisable. That doesn't mean it would be easy to revise a lot of our beliefs. But, truth plays the role of reminding us that all the evidence may not be in. And it should keep us humble for that. And I don't find the folks that are in the grip of this old narrative about business, that it's about the money and shareholders, and the only way to change it is corporate governance and slash pay. I don't find that to be very persuasive.
And that gives me almost the lead to another question. And I know Otti wants to go to CSR, but let me just very quickly mingle that question in. We often cite Schumacher because that's a nice site. He said, our modern experiment to live without religion has failed. So, of course, one of the questions is, what is there instead? Spirituality, faith, or consciousness? And I hear in pragmatism a lot of reflective action. Call it consciousness, call it reflective action, but that seems to be something which is also quite clearly anchored, maybe even more clearly than the ethical core. What are your thoughts on that? Is that what you're feeling?
Sure. I think that's right. I'm not particularly a person of faith, but there's some pragmatists who are, and I don't think, of course, James is with his famous book, The Variety of Religious Experiences, who talked about that. I tend to, the way I think about it is that, we can all have private conceptions based on whatever. So you might be an evangelical Christian. I might be a kind of worms and dust Darwinian. And if we're having a conversation about ethics, and I give you worms and dust reasons for something, or evolutionary reasons, you're not going to be moved. And if you give me evangelical Christian reasons, I'm not going to be moved. So what we have to do is find some reasons in civic space, in the public space, that we both can agree upon. And this is why the breakdown in civil society is so important, because we've lost the ability, or we're losing, certainly in the US, losing the ability to do that. We're instead just shouting our private conceptions louder across each other. And, it's like one of us is speaking French and the other is speaking German, and we don't really understand each other, but we just say it louder. We have to be able to find in that sort of public sphere reasons that lots of people can agree on. Now, there are lots of reasons. There are lots of things people can agree on. There's something that I think the philosopher Alan Dworth or Alan Donegan, one of them, called common morality, which is certainly a lot that's in. There are differences, but there's a lot that's in common around most of pretty much all of the major religions in the world. There's a lot that's in common. If you ask people, as I have, pretty much all over the world, write down their top 3 values. The way I put it is, write down the top 3 values you want to teach your children. If you don't have children, write down the top 3 values you wish other people teach their children. And of course, everybody writes down the same thing. They write down, respect, responsibility, love and care, integrity, those kinds of things. And of course, showing respect in Indonesia is different than showing respect in Zurich, right? What it means to care for family differs in Nigeria than it might in Canada, right? But those are cultural differences. I think the value, we have a lot in common, but we're often culturally inept at trying to translate those values into conversation. And then when we add on this sort of angry ideology or this private conception, again, which everybody should have, but there's a way to reason among these differing private conceptions. By the way, this is exactly the view of John Rawls in his Pragmatist book, not a theory of justice, but the second book, which I'm blanking on right now. But if probably I turn to my bookshelf.
But if I try to summarize a little bit, so it's the common ground, of course, it's being reflective of our worldviews and seeing also where we can still have a conversation. It's the really trying to get into a dialogue. So that is a core of pragmatism, and it's probably then also what we need even in a society where religion might have failed or not have failed to kind of bring it together. But I think just because Otti looks a little bit perplexed because I was supposed to ask you about corporate social responsibility. Can we find a way back to that one? Or
Sure. I was just going to mention there was a great book written in the 60s by Donald Schoen called The Reflective Practitioner, which is a book that bears reading and rereading. I think Schoen was way ahead of his time for that.
We had Bill Torbert on the series, and Bill Torbert is picking up many of the work on Schoen and Argyris in terms of his action logic. And I think, actually, I would say Bill in his action inquiry and action theory is actually very close to pragmatism, I would say. We didn't ask him that question.
Yeah.
But I think his work is very inspirational. And we will look up that Rawls reference because certainly
Political Liberalism is the book. I think it's called Political Liberalism.
Political liberalism.
Because certainly with the veil of ignorance and so on and the theory of justice, we had our troubles. I think I think we're moving into the second section now, but maybe I guess I hope everybody will have understood the concept of pragmatism now, because I think that what we wanted to do, as we said earlier, is really through this dialogue bring a little bit this perspective, which I think has come through very clearly, at least for me. But I will still, there's two kind of distinctions that we wanted to still get your views on, maybe just very quickly. One was CSR, because you're describing the difference between stakeholder capitalism and CSR very eloquently many times. So just maybe a quick situational statement, so to speak. And then the common goods theory, because here we have heard from a number of our guests that they believe in the common good, and I think Alejo Cizon calls it the intermediate association. The business is an organism of society and therefore has a duty from its very constitution, so to speak, to contribute to society at large, which is something that in your configuration of stakeholders, in the interpretation of some people at least, wasn't so evident that there would be some sort of duty towards society. So if I wonder, could you just maybe to finish this section, position yourself in the context of those two?
So on CSR, I tried to argue in the old book, I tried to argue that if you took the stakeholder idea seriously, you just didn't need it. The way I would say that now is if I say to you, or you were to say to me, look, I love your company. Customers love you because you make their lives better. Suppliers want to work with you because you make them better. Employees, it's a long line of people who want to sign up to work for your company because you treat them with respect and dignity. Communities want to have you there because you're a community builder and you're making money hand over fist. What I want to know is, are you socially responsible? Okay, I don't have much idea what you mean by that. You might mean, Sergei Dmitriev, Dr. Obhurish and I just did a paper on trying to say this, as those two sort of made me sort of think through where not only where the overlap is, but where there's something about CSR that is not contained always in that it might be that CSR is just about how you deal with community, but it might be that there are bigger issues in society that you want to deal with that are not necessarily community issues. And that might be a place for CSR. So I'm much friendlier to the idea now than I used to be, because with the old story, CSR played a different role. It played the role of, people in the mafia killing people during the week and going to church on Sunday. Business sucks. It's this bad thing, but I'll give some money to the opera or to the community, and that'll make up for it. And that seemed to me to be not a very interesting idea. So I think CSR and CSR, if you use it as a way to think about what's my obligation to communities, and I take that to be a hard question, because communities is a really fuzzy idea. Then I think it's important. Too often it separates what's social from what's economic, and that's a logic problem. Because if I hire you, if I've done something that has social consequences, sure. Have I done something with economic consequences? Yes. That's true for every stakeholder. So if I have two concepts, A and B, and I have instances of these things, and I got to figure out where to put the data, if every time something's an A, it's that economic consequence, it's also a B, then the distinction between A's and B's is not very interesting.
One thing that comes to mind, Ed, is we listened to Mats Snipper, the CEO of Ørsted, which is a Scandinavian company in oil and gas and moving towards green energy. And one thing Mats was talking about was the responsibility for a blueprint. And what he meant by that is that in today's day and age, multiple organizations businesses might need to work together to have a positive impact on society. So it actually derived a responsibility claim to associate with other businesses even to make a positive impact. And I thought that was maybe something not contained, so to speak, in that Venn diagram.
I think that's a really good idea. And I think part of that comes from what your sense of purpose is.
Exactly.
Right. Again, some companies are going to say our purpose is to somehow make society better, and they would articulate it as having an obligation to society as a whole rather than communities. I think what I did was I didn't like the economic social distinction, and I still think that's not a very good distinction. Michael Porter discovers that economic things have social consequences. Really? Gee, that's a tough discovery.
I think you share some common people you don't like.
No, I have a lot of respect and admiration. But social and economic, all you have to do is read a little bit of Amartya Sen for a long time to kind of understand this stuff. And the problem for me is that a lot of the strategy theorists don't read much of economists like Sen, who I think is much more interesting, or the philosopher Martha Nussbaum, who wrote with him. So I'm not opposed to saying you have obligations to society, but I do want to focus on one thing here, and that is the focus on obligation and what philosophers would call the right, because I think we could fulfill our obligations and might still have a pretty nasty society. That we really want to think about not only the right, but what's good. and trying to understand how the right and the good can work together, versus what most philosophers do is they would take the big four of ethical theory. They generally would call it big three, but I'd add the fourth, rights, consequences, virtue, and care. And they'd have a big, long, centuries long argument as to which one's really true or which one's the best. And we sort of looked at it as, look, there are four lenses. Some of them are going to help you solve some problems and not solve others. And the point about using our judgment is to be able to figure that out, as best we can. And we're fallible. We need some humility in the mix to do that. So I'm not sure, thinking about obligation, as many business ethicists want to do, what are your obligations to stakeholders? Well, how can this business build something that's actually good? And clearly you don't want to, violate any sort of basic human obligations, but trying to load up ethics in obligation, I think I'd rather keep that to a pretty minimal idea, because I think freedom and responsibility are so important to the good society.
And I think that's something which comes across in all your paper, that it's about building a better life for those who are involved. And I think there you already have what you were now also putting so nicely. But I hear this good life, that's how I call it now, and the relationships. And that probably moves us into the organizational part. How would you operationalize these relationships? And it also brings us a little bit back to my not critique to the strategic management literature, because there I'm not so amazed, because indeed we have a lot of economists writing there, but also to the stakeholder management field. I was amazed when I read your 2010 article that you had to call for research in what are the key dimensions of each stakeholder relationship, because I would think that is core. And the other research you were calling for in 2010, which also wasn't there very strongly, is this network, which you always talk about. What are the interaction effects? Now, that was 2010. Now, 2022, have we made progress? What do we know about the most important relationship dimensions, and especially these network effects, which I believe are so timely and so important to understand?
Well, we probably have made some progress. I have sort of lost track of a lot of the hundreds of empirical studies that have been done that I just am not able to keep track of really anymore. I think the network effects, I would say, are more what I would call the interaction effects.
Yeah.
How does what I do with customers affect what I do with employees? And so, if you want to measure total value created, you could measure total value created for each stakeholder, but there's going to be some interaction effects that might not be there. The problem with the network framing, as opposed to thinking about this as how are these connected, problem with the network framing is you always I learned this stuff from one of the great, originators of systems theory, Russell Aikoff and Eric Trist, when they were at Wharton when I was a young guy. And the problem with looking at the whole system is you're almost always seduced into managing the system. And managing the system, in my reading of history, almost always turns into totalitarianism. And the title of Richard Rorty's last book is Pragmatism as Anti-Authoritarianism. And there is an anti-authoritarian, very, very much flavor to at least what I've tried to write about stakeholder theory. I think Rob Phillips has done a couple of nice papers on network effects. They have a new one that maps out sort of all of stakeholder theory into these networks of people doing stuff in that's just out in business and society. So maybe we know some things about them. In terms of operationalizing this, I'm not sure I understand what that call is for. Every company I know operationalizes how it deals with its customers. Mm-hmm. It has lots of ways of measuring how well it does that. Many of them have figured out that they need to worry about supply chains. And so they've added some of those measures to how they deal with suppliers. And any of them that are worth their salt has an employee survey, even though they might not pay it enough attention, but they have that. Some, and I think fewer here, haven't yet operationalized how they measure how they deal with communities. But some have, how they deal with communities, and they've used things like the Edelman Trust surveys and those kinds of tools as well. And of course, everybody knows how they're doing with shareholders. So what we haven't figured out. So this idea that how do you measure this stuff? I've never been, I've never thought that was much of a question. It might be a question for academics, but not real managers. They know how to do this, and they do it all the time. They often see it as trade-offs with each other, because what they miss, and what I think is a harder question, is how does our strategy with customers, or how does our interactions with customers affect our interactions with employees? For instance, one of the things that many companies are finding out, I mean, they shouldn't be surprised to them, is that if you treat employees lousy, you're probably going to lose customers, right? Or you might lose suppliers. And so the so-called Great Resignation that's been going on after the pandemic is in part a lot of companies rediscovering that, hey, we need to treat our employees a lot better. We need to figure out how to revitalize this relationship.
Mm-hmm. The difference again. I think, being 25 years in business, so to speak, I think we measure lots of stuff. And going back to Norton Kaplan in terms of creating balanced scorecards and the likes, but a lot of it is teleological, so to speak. It's deterministic to achieve profit at the end. So the notion of value is reduced to financial value. So I think I'm not sure I'm hearing you right, but I think your notion of value goes beyond that. And I've been following a little bit with our friend Michele Zanini some of the discussions on ESG metrics, for example, right? And it's utter confusion. There are 15 different versions. People self-report on certain things. Nobody knows exactly how to frame is it do no harm or is it do some good? Where should we be? So I do think the measurement space is still one that certainly for me seems very hard. And Henry Mintzberg said in a session we had, the problem is efficiency is always measurable efficiency, and all the good things in life we cannot measure. So how do you think about that?
Well, I think that's Henry's usual statement, and I love Henry. He's really a terrific human being. I've learned a lot from, but you can measure some good stuff. I think you can measure, for instance, your health, not just in terms of efficiency. You can measure some of the good that businesses do. We could measure when Medtronic says, "Gee, we're gonna give the blueprints to our ventilators to other people to do, because it's not a time to think about profits now," and other kinds of things. What I'm happy about is that Just Capital is, again, trying to find new measures. You're right. We need some new measures too. But the criticism is always profit's the only thing you can really measure and be sure. And I think that's just wrong. There are lots of measures that people do. Now, they might, balanced scorecard aims at profit and doesn't go far enough. And oftentimes what happens is these measures are internally focused. They're not focused on what stakeholders are the value that's actually created for them.
And they're aggregated. I think your point on put names and faces to stakeholders, right? There's also the uniqueness of the value in the relationship is not honored. But if I may, I want to go a little bit into the operationalization in terms of how they translate it into practices. And if you say maybe there's not so much we can dictate as good practices, I still think you're writing about some bad practices. But I want to go to this in your book, which was for people like me, managing the stakeholder. You take quite a bit of time to explain your view of strategy. So this idea of ethical leadership as strategy, and you focus on the notion that we have to get away from five forces analyses and the resource-based view and focus on four components: purpose and values, stakeholders and principles, and the social context. And again, you said it a few times, responsibility and ethical leadership, which we will do in the next section. So here, maybe could you explain what you think today about this? How does strategy work out in your paradigm? And how do you create a coherence across those purpose and values in linkage to stakeholders, and then what it means to how you run your company? If you could just give us a glimpse of what's on your mind.
Well, I think the most important thing would be to say that purpose doesn't live in the purpose statement. Purpose lives in the systems and processes. I know so many companies have had, and organizations, you talked about how important people are, and they have a lousy HR system. So many companies today are, doing the purpose rethink, to get a great sounding purpose statement. They're not many of them are going far enough to do, well, let's do a kind of systems audit. Let's see what the systems are in terms of how we deal with, let's say, employees, or how we deal with customers. And let's figure out where we can improve those things. There's an old technique that's always impressed me that J&J used, back in the long time ago when there was the extra strength Tylenol debacle. People were killed. 8 people died because they took extra strength Tylenol. It was a tampering thing. And Johnson & Johnson took Tylenol off the market, $500 million off the bottom line, and yet they got it back and became a leader in tamper-resistant packaging. Jim Burke was the CEO then. What most people didn't know was the year before, Burke had gone around the world and talked to J&J people and said, here's our purpose statement, the credo, which is the way they talked about values and stakeholders and purpose. Now, where are we not living it? Where are we not living it? Do we need to change it? Do we need to take it down off the wall? Or do we need to change the systems and processes? This became part of the development process at J&J. And this idea that if you have a purpose statement and you don't allow people to push back and tell you where you're not living it, you don't really have a meaningful purpose statement. Oftentimes what happens is purpose gets translated into a lot of stuff about markets and that's kind of a strategy statement, I guess. And it doesn't go all the way through. So I see strategy as more some intermediate step here between purpose on the one hand, purpose and values, and actual the systems and processes. And if you do it without the systems and processes or without the purpose, I don't think it's very effective. So I see strategy itself as actually less effective, if you like, or less important than it used to be.
Does this point go towards one question that we had, and final one for me in this section is, does that not point to some necessity almost for collective wisdom? So that the ability to read, go on, Antoinette.
Yeah, I just want to take it up because I think exactly we can bring this together even. I think in one paper you differentiated between a containment strategy, which for me is the dark side, and I think we're going to talk about that, and the collaboration strategy. And in the collaboration strategy, you also envisaged this collective wisdom that what he was telling about, and maybe stakeholder boards. So maybe it would be interesting to see the high-end, very co-creating practices, and then maybe if you can make a stunt and look at this. This is a very new paper of you where you look at these pathological problems in organizations, which I would characterize also distrust, greed, and everything. So we'll have a look at how to contain, in that case, the practices. So maybe you can do that stump between these two different, very positive, very containment-oriented practices.
Well, it's actually an old paper. It took us forever to get it published. So it was the idea. I've always thought that Freud and his followers had a lot to say to people in business, and someone like Manfred Katz de Vries, again another hero of mine, who seems to understand that. But most of management, etc., is completely disconnected from the psychoanalytic literature. Which basically says we may not be the best ones to know what's in our hearts. And so what we tried to do in that paper was to look at how some things go wrong and diagnose that back into, what kind of thing has gone wrong in the sort of executive mindset. And we use a lot of Katz de Vries stuff. So, for instance, trying to see what kind of ethical mistake narcissists are liable to make, or psychopaths, etc. I don't know. We haven't pushed that very far, so I don't know much about what to make of it. Clearly, I think this gets at this idea of the self, and we have these competing ideas of the self. We have, on the one hand, the self is this little individual bubble of autonomy, and whenever these two bubbles of autonomy conflict, we invoke a rights claim as who has the right of way, versus the idea of the self as connected. I am the set of relationships in which I'm enmeshed, and not an or, and I'm trying to make something of my life that's unique. Mm-hmm. So there's this connection and individuality, if you like, that have to lie together. There's a really terrific paper by Dick Rorty on trying to understand kind of how this works and connecting it back to Nietzsche, who thought, Nietzsche thought, well, you didn't want to be one of the herd. You wanted to do something that was unique, and that's true. But there's also what we're able to do is a function of the relationships that we've been in. That's how transference works. We transfer relationships of when we were young to our caregivers. We transfer that to people we see today. We do that unconsciously. So, I'm a summary in part of the set of relationships, my parents, my grandmother, my siblings, the people I went to school with in Georgia. I'm a summary of those relationships and what I got from there. And I'm also trying to make something unique out of that, not to oppose that. And so what that says is that if we recognize that we're pro-social creatures or we're collaborative creatures, we're likely to live more satisfying lives, I think. Sorry, phone.
Interesting ringtone.
Yeah, it's an old blues thing. Yeah.
But I think maybe we can take this point to go towards leadership, because I think, so one, just to agree with you very strongly, Manfred is one of the people who we will interview, because because Manfred, I qualified in system psychodynamics at INSEAD, and Manfred, of course, is one of the faculty there, as is Giampiero Pittiglieri and a few others, and Simon Weston, who we already interviewed. And I think we're intrigued both by this notion of individual pathologies and neuroticisms, but also the gestalt, kind of the organizational dynamics. And we will talk hopefully to people like Susan Long on organizational role analysis. So how do you situate the role and the individual in that meshed relationships that you described? So maybe on leadership, I think what would be really interesting, I've forgotten about the great jackass fallacy that I thought was a really, really nice thing that we might want to bring in somewhere. But you describe the role of ethical leadership, again, in that book on managing stakeholders. You also have written, Antoinette found out about responsible leadership in another piece that you wrote. And I just wonder, could you, and then you write what I found extremely interesting, the role of the business ethicist. So could you take us a little bit through what's the relevance of leadership in the context of your theory? How do you see responsible or ethical leadership today, building on your theories that you've exposed? I think that would be a great starting point here.
Sure, I'll try. I came at this, I taught a course called Leadership, Ethics, and Values. And whenever you ask people to write down the names of leaders, first two names that come to mind. So you're trying to get them to free associate.
Yes, Nelson Mandela.
Nelson Mandela always, and Gandhi probably. Martin Luther King.
Almost never. Never.
Okay.
Maybe.
But it's not Jeff Bezos or something like
that. Mostly dead white guys.
Okay.
Presidents, ex-presidents, football coaches.
Okay.
Mostly here in the U.S. and in Europe, but nonetheless, very few people of color, very few women, very few family members, very few people that the students actually knew. So this had me start thinking about this idea of leadership, and I became a little bit. I read Jim Collins, who was a friend of mine, and talked to him about it. And I became a little bit of a leadership skeptic. You know, Collins writes about being a leadership skeptic, like in the Middle Ages. Why did my crop fail? God did it. Why did my child get sick? God did it. Why did my hair turn gray? God did it. And, that leadership's kind of the same way. Why did this organization succeed? Leadership. Why did this product launch fail? Leadership. And Collins was sort of a skeptic of this. And then when he's writing Good to Great, his research team has to have an intervention with him to say, wait a minute, leadership really matters. So it's a certain kind of leadership. It's not this charismatic stuff. It's people who have a high degree of humility and are kind of fiercely determined around purpose and things. And so as I thought about it, the other thing people would say sometimes in that survey was they would say Hitler. And, a bad guy, but he got stuff done. Now, my view of that was, well, wait a minute. If leadership gives you people like that, I don't need this idea of leadership. So there's an idea of leadership about getting stuff done, which I think dominates, et cetera. And there's an idea about personality, which is the charismatic stuff, which dominates. And so I thought about it, and I thought, let me think about somebody who I would say was a leader, who I know personally. And I thought about my grandmother. It's very important to me. I learned a lot about ethics from her. She had like 8 or 9 kids, and so didn't work outside the home. In 1930, what would it have been? My mother was like 1935 or so. Her husband was killed in an industrial accident, middle of the Great Depression. she takes to the road selling shoes to provide for the family. I learned a lot from her. I saw her as leader of the family, as matriarch. So, I would always list Martin Luther King and John Kennedy. And I started listing my grandmother. Who's the person that about leadership that's about that. And then I got, and I wrote some stuff. I wrote that a chapter in Managing for Stakeholders then, and I wrote about responsible leadership, etc. More recently, we just had a book come out at Oxford University Press called Models of Leadership from Plato and Beyond. Dominic Scott, who's a Plato professor at Oxford, had been at UVA, and we had worked together. And so Plato had 6 or 7 models of leadership, the teacher, the shepherd, the sower. There's no need to go into all of it. But there are a couple of things that were incredibly important about Plato that I think we've forgotten. The first is that Plato didn't have an idea of ethical leadership. Now, why is this? Because Plato contrasted leaders with tyrants. Leaders were when you call somebody a leader, you kind of automatically are expressing some approval of them. And we shouldn't express approval of tyrants. And so I think today we've separated that out. So
very interesting.
We call people we call people leaders, but they're just tyrants, right? They're just telling people what to do and using their power to force them what to do. That's not leadership.
Thank you, Ed, with one thought maybe, which is maybe just for you, if it's interesting. We interviewed Simon Weston. Simon Weston has done an analysis of leadership discourses throughout time and written a book about it. It's very interesting. And I think your point on narrative resonates very strongly with what Simon is doing. Very happy to provide references. The other thing that we found interesting is Carol Sanford's work on nodal roles. So how can leaders step into roles that have systemic relevance? And she's exploring that, which I found interesting. But one thing that stuck with me reading your chapter, so you define a number of ethical leadership principles in your work, like the leadership principle and the stakeholder principle and so on. Yeah. And then you basically, and sorry for being slightly kind of skeptical here, but you have a long list of ethical leadership tasks. So it seems like you're creating like a list of what stuff that I should do as a business leader. And that contrasts very strongly with kind of my credo, and we're going to interview Bob Keegan as one of the people also on this inquiry, with this vertical development, personal development. And Antoinette told me that in your more recent work on responsible leaders, you went into self-development and consciousness and vertical development. So I just wonder, where are you on this? Is this more like principles and tasks, or is it more like developing myself? Where have you left?
No, I think I'd be on the development part. I think the principles and tasks, we were trying in that book, to have, things people could take on and do that were task kinds of things. But I think thinking about leadership development, in fact, I have a friend who's a very accomplished business leader who would say, you always need an edge where you're trying to develop yourself to get better about something, and thinking about that, I think is more interesting. So I think I haven't read that chapter in a long time, and it's probably for good reason I haven't read it. I didn't read it when we wrote the Plato book.
Well, it's just interesting because if I looked at the responsible leadership, where you come up with this poetic self, there, of course, you have a lot of different really development issues, personality development in there. And I found that very interesting. I was then, however, asking myself a little bit, and I'm always asking that, are we doing any kind of that type of development in what we are working at? I mean, you're also a dedicated teacher, but are we doing personal development in universities? How would that look like? Maybe even going back a little bit to what pragmatists have as ideas to develop action logics or other ideas?
Well, we actually do spend time doing that here at Darden. It's a general management program, and so we spend a fair amount of time doing some assessment. A colleague of mine is absolutely brilliant, Bobby Parmar, that I've written several books with. He and Jim Dietert developed a leadership lab in which they used a whole number of simulations with actors, putting people in situations that they could, they had to figure out how to make it through those situations, and then videoing them and watching how they did it and having them do it again, etc. This leadership lab was, I think, one of the key experiences that a lot of students have had. So we do spend time doing experiential things, because that's how you have to learn it. I think too many universities don't do any experiential learning, and they kind of miss the point of it. Are we doing enough? Probably not.
I want to throw in one thought here. And which Antoinette and I were, of course, you made us read a lot of things, and
sorry,
we were kind of a bit swearing and said, here you're saying this thing, this is again something slightly different. So we, like you said, it was really hard to nail. So we came to this conclusion that actually what you were doing, beyond creating a narrative, was sowing doubts. And we came to this idea that you were a weaver of doubts rather than a salesman of hope, which reminded us of Bill Torbett. So Bill Torbett has these action logics in personal development, and the final one is what he calls an ionist. And an ionist is a bit of a jester, someone who disrupts patterns, who sows doubt so that people start to reflect about what they're doing. And we recall with Carol Sanford, when she came on, she didn't want to even do what we had in our agenda because she wanted to disrupt our pattern. So one question I have is that a little bit your theory, that you're trying to cause positive doubt in trying to help people develop their thinking? And then secondly, on the narrative, to Antoinette's point, what is the new narrative for business schools? You say we need a new narrative for business, but what about business schools? So kind of, what is your technique? Have we got it a little bit? And then secondly, what's the narrative?
Well, first of all, I've been found out. I see myself very much as the jester, as the trickster. Some of my favorite characters in literature are the tricksters. Now, I happen to think that hope comes from sowing doubt. If I can examine what I believe and not have the wool pulled over my eyes, I can create real hope about what's possible and what's not. So I would just say, typical pragmatist answer, those things go together. But definitely some of my favorite characters in literature are the trickster characters. The fool. Friends of mine started a company called the Motley Fool. CEO is the chief fool. Fool in the sense of Shakespeare and Euripides and others. And I again, that's how I would, if I had to pick, a description, that's what I would do. In terms of business schools, I'm of two minds about this. I think there's one part of me that says, I'm the luckiest guy in the world. I have a job at a school that has taken ethics seriously long before anybody else did. We've raised a lot of money for it. Our students want to study ethics, We've managed to turn the ethics courses into a suite of courses in the humanities, from theater, literature, music, and all around making people more fully human leaders. And I have a lot of colleagues, even colleagues in finance and decision analysis and operations and organization behavior, who worry about ethics and that sort of stuff. So I had the best job in the world. And I think we do a lot that's right. And I spend a lot of time at other schools as well. And, I think there's a danger of business schools becoming just irrelevant. We're and the reason is not necessarily the sort of lack of embracing stakeholder theory, because more and more in more disciplines are. The reason is the being in the grip of this positivism. Look, there's not, how do you know this? You don't sit and wonder as a real executive, oh, gee, I can't wait for the latest issue of Academy of Management Review or AMJ or
Quarterly.
ASQ. I wonder what those management people discovered today. No, there's not a soul out there who ever thinks about that. I've been lucky to have a bunch of friends who are CEOs, and they think it's the funniest thing in the world.
Mm-hmm. See, that's why I'm working together with Otti, although it can be quite frustrating because he keeps on telling me that we're writing nonsense.
Well, it might be nonsense. I don't think for the most part it's very. And what's happened is we've pumped up the incentives. Look, I just finished 5 years as co-editor with Michelle Greenwood at Journal of Business Ethics. We have 3,000 papers a year from all over the world. I wish I could say that half those 3,000 papers would have made a difference in the world, but I don't think it's close to that percentage. And so what's happened is everybody and this is in part driven by the rankings, everybody wants to publish in these top journals, of which JBE is a Financial Times 50 journal. And so it drives behavior. I mean, I had people threaten to sue me because they got a revise and resubmit letter they didn't like. And others.
In Journal of Business Ethics, I mean, this is a special.
Well, there's irony everywhere, and so I'm not. And if you try to create ways for people to do innovative stuff that might make a difference, for the most part, you don't have that many people who will do it. Why? Because they're again, so many people are measured based on how many publications in what journals. No one reads the papers anymore, and I don't mean, you'd never read it, but people inside the world don't read it. They just note what journal it's in, and if it's in ASQ, that's
we
an
don't
A.
talk about content. We talk about where it's published. That's
a formal fallacy.
Yeah.
That even Plato, as bad a logician as he might have been at some point, wouldn't have made. It's appeal to authority. So that's a very strong norm. And it's stronger in some disciplines than others. But I think unless we can lose that, business schools are going to become more irrelevant. We might see them move towards people who care a lot about business being the ones who invent ideas. I think a lot of the people you're interviewing care a lot about business. And we do too. That's one of the reasons I'm at Darden, is I really love thinking about business. And it's why I've always thought stakeholder theory was about the business model. It's not about it's about other stuff, but it's primarily about trying to figure out how people can create better businesses. And that's what professional schools should do. They should socialize people into the language of the.
To your point on positivism, sorry, I'm chipping in, but then I think if I think about Stefano Zamagni, who's writing about the civil economy, I think one of his final statements was kind of the relationships, the quality of the relationships that we have, that is our economy. So this the separation fallacy of thinking as the economy as a separate system to society is just creating all sorts of wrong ideas. And the moment we accept economy is just a viewpoint on normal societal social interaction, then I think new streets open of thoughts and of making sense of the world. And I think that, like you say, also in your care ethics article, this kind of caring becomes much more prevalent and necessary than the focus on the product, the production process, and the caring in the process is eudaimonia. That is the good life in an Aristotelian sense, right? And I think
business is complicated. There are lots of vocabularies that we can use. Economics is one. It's not oftentimes the best, but there are lots of other vocabularies that will help us here. I tend to think that if we understood more about the vocabulary of jazz, we would have more insight into why people can do what they do in teams, etc. But you know, a lot of people started this some time ago, but not much has come from it.
But Ed, I need to still ask you something. I mean, you have been chief editor. I'm also now in a senior position, but I still see also us maybe sometimes to be being maybe not courageous enough. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm
right.
kind of wondering. I mean, we have now written a paper which is much more with the what if logic. But Sybil is kind of, oh my God, we can't do what if logic. So it is still very, very difficult, obviously, to come up with a more creative way and say, well, but let's look at this. How would the world look differently if that was real?
Referees won't. First of all, you don't know who to get to referee it. Referees won't.
They will not like it, probably.
It won't like. So I've been talking with one journal about doing a special issue on the paper you always wanted to write, but I have a feeling nobody's going to write them. We tried to start a journal called Stakeholder Theory and Practice, in which the referees were going to be coaches, and their job was to make your paper better, and they would be expected to publish their commentaries on your paper. And of course, the problem was we couldn't get people to submit papers. So I don't know. Maybe I'm too negative. I mean, the MBA is I guess a degree that's become widely accepted around the world. I think you'll see the 2-year residential MBA turn into a 1-year degree, and you're already seeing a move towards everything online. I think that's too bad because, we need to look each other in the eye and have hard conversations with each other, and we need practice in doing that.
The one thing that I'm taking away, because we have 5 minutes left, and Antoinette, in our usual fashion, will try to close us out with a little quiz. We've learned from coaching that we need to create closure for a conversation so that we can all go with
I do that in my podcast, so that's we have something called 3 burning questions. Everybody has to do at the end. Yeah.
And it's great. And I think one thing that I'm taking very, very strongly from this conversation is that notion of narrative, because I think we were a little bit skeptical about progress. And Harry Tsukas told us in the podcast or webcast we had with him, he said, well, but listen to what people say around you. Listen to how the narrative is changing. And again, I think there was an interesting definition of power. Power is not a person or something. Power is a change in potentiality. And I think this notion of you have introduced, and not only you, but all the people around you, you guys have introduced a new narrative into the societal ocean of conversation that is changing, so to speak, the potentiality of business to become better. And I think that is brilliant. And I love your challenge on the Business Roundtable, because I think in one of your books you say, according to Planck, a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. And I think we want to be that generation coming, so we go away with a lot of hope.
Science progresses one funeral at a time.
Funeral at a time. So I think in that vein, can I just do one thing before we go to the quiz? Maybe just going around the table and one thing that either stuck with you from this conversation or one thing that we haven't said and you really want to tell whoever listens to this afterwards. So maybe Antoinette, can I start with you and then kind of give Ed the final word, because I think that's what it should be.
Yeah, we covered a lot of grounds, but I mean, what really stuck with me as a very important part is we're not talking about relativism, but pluralism. And pluralism means that we're really also looking at what is the problem at hand? How can we make the life of the people involved, which are, of course, then the stakeholders, better, in a sense, create value together. So I like that crunching up, it became clearer to me. And on that account, we can then also look at different normative cores related to that. The next thing which I believe I found, I find this, the value fact dichotomy a very important one. I would like to shout that out into the world. You have been shouting that out for a very long time. We still have it. And I just have to, Otti was invited to a PhD seminar where we were asking the PhDs, why are you doing your PhD thesis? And I was expecting them saying something like, I want to make a better world, or I'm driven by, and I always say, I don't want to have any suffering machines any longer. But they were really kind of even shy to say their purpose, their values. Maybe they didn't even realize that they have values. So it's still very much alive and kicking. And they don't realize that if in the end I'm going to measure how does this variable relate to profit, that this, of course, is also a value statement. So that's the second thing I would like to make very clear again. And then I'm just thinking, kind of looking into the future. I do like this interaction effects. I like this idea to look at relationships in this broader web. I think there a lot should still be done, and a lot can be also taken up by things you have already talked about, maybe teased out as a gesture. But I believe researcher, please listen and take it up. That's what I would kind of summarize it for me.
Well, for me, the narrative is the key thing. The gist, as the second one, it resonates very strongly with Bill Torbett's notion, and I think we really need to think about what can we learn from how you have tried to influence the narrative kind of in the way that we might go about our own inquiry. I find that very, very compelling. I think the other thing I take is the humility, because I think whilst you're kind of, I was very struck by your writings where you almost were trying to step into everybody's shoes and look at the world from their perspective. You said, if I take Friedman's perspective, actually, this is how we can come together. If I take Porter's perspective, this is even Jensen, right? Which frankly, I struggle with, right? Every time I see him, I go red. So kind of even there you said, well, listen, there's also a way we can come together. And you did it for the disciplines like marketing and finance and so on. So I think your approach of actually not getting enamored into your own theory, being able to take the different perspectives and still create a narrative that has power in changing the way people see the world. I think that for me is fascinating. And I think you've given us a lot of thought, not to think about. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks. Those are really kind words from both of you. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've enjoyed that both of you can laugh with me about things, because if we can't laugh at ourselves and what we're trying to do, life is too short. We have a saying in the music business. I don't know if it's a saying in music. It's the saying I say in the music business, which is, if you write a good melody and you keep playing the record over and over, eventually people start humming the tune. Again, I get way too much credit. Lots of people are humming the Stakeholder tune now, and I think there's a point at which there's no going back to shareholder primacy. So I think it's up to us to figure out how to make our business institutions places for our children to live in, and that's the way I like to think about it. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to play the melody, to play the record one more time.
Well, thank you very much, but that are not the famous last words, although they almost would be. And we have this little quiz, and I just run it through you, and we'll see what comes out. So
okay.
We start, of course, with the question about the good life for you. Now, if you could choose among the following options, which one would you choose? Winning the big barbecue competition, go for a year on tour with Otis Redding, have a weekend to develop your ideas with John Dewey, or winning $1 million in the lottery?
Well, the Dewey one is what you might think, but if it meant bringing Otis Redding back from the dead and a year more of his music, I'm sorry, Professor Dewey. I think I got to go with Otis.
I had kind of a feeling it could come up this way, but interesting still. Okay, then we touched a little bit on that, but you also have a choice for that one. What is the biggest problem with society today? A lack of good stories and hope, lack of leadership and action, lack of reflection and consciousness, or lack of love and caring?
The right answer is all of the above, but the most important one is the last one, a lack of love and caring.
Okay.
That does a lot.
Now, if you would want to develop stakeholder paradigm further, where would you look first for inspiration? Europe, e.g. the Rhineland countries, or Asia, e.g. Japan, or Africa, e.g. Ubuntu, or would you stick with the US?
Well, I try to do a little of all, but I'd stick with what I know about with the U.S. and especially the entrepreneurs, the young entrepreneurs that are starting things, and I'm sure that's there in the other places too. But I would probably be able to do more in the U.S. and hope that others do the same in the rest of the world.
I have two more.
Yeah, sure. I might steal this for my podcast. So these are great. I like this.
If you could start over, would you still go for that philosophy PhD?
Absolutely. No, I have absolutely no regrets. I paraphrased William James, who said, first course he was trained in psychology, said the first lecture in philosophy was the first one that he heard, was the first one he gave. First lecture in management I heard was the first one I gave. And I'm fine with that. Philosophy, both at Duke and at Washington University, I got a great education. They taught me how to think. And that's all you can ask.
My business school colleagues have to listen to what you were just saying.
my CEO colleagues, CXO colleagues as well.
So the last one would be, if I could change one thing in the world to make it a better place, what would you do or recommend our listeners to do?
Have a conversation with the people that are important to you and live with passion. You know, I could have said world peace, but that wouldn't have been cool. But you know, we need to acknowledge the relationships we're in, and then we need to pursue those with some passion. I have a colleague that said, you know, it's time to be well rested when you're dead, and I think that's right. You just don't want to hasten the process. I tend to like to be around people who are doing the hell out of whatever they're doing.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Whatever you do, I think that's a great finishing line.
Yeah.
It also reminds me of our set with Alan Watkins. Alan said, when did you last have a meeting with yourself? Which I think is important. People should look in the mirror. And I think add your advice, have a meeting with the people you care about and bring those perspectives in. And then whatever you do, kind of make the hell of it. I love that finishing line. All is read and come on. And with that, I would say, Ed, we expected it to be a huge pleasure. And I have to say, it was a wonderful pleasure. Even if you made us sweat in the preparation for it, it was worth every hour. And again, I want to just wholeheartedly say big thanks. And thanks for the narrative that you've created. We will certainly do our very best to try to propagate it for soon. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.